Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Pratik and I'll be taking up the News Today discussion for 25th April. So let us start with the main news. We have 5 main news and we have couple of quick updates. So in the very first news, Supreme Court has allowed a 15-year-old girl to medically terminate pregnancy. The second news, RBI cancels banking license of Paytm Payments Bank. Third news, India's bioeconomy is projected to grow to $1 trillion economy by 2047. Fourth news, locally led climate adaptation gains urgency in India. And the last news, extreme weather events threaten terrestrial biodiversity by 2085 according to a study. Then we also have certain quick updates. Let us start with the very first news, that is, Supreme Court in a recent decision has allowed a 15-year-old girl to medically terminate over 7-month pregnancy or 28-month pregnancy. And this topic is particularly important from GS paper 2 polity, that is Supreme Court powers of the judiciary and how judiciary plays a critical role in the whole rights-based democracy. And also it is pertinent from social issues in terms of gender justice and women empowerment. So here we will look into two major aspects. First will be what is the significance of the news or the judgment. And the second important aspect that we will be looking into is the issues that arise due to the autonomy, the reproductive autonomy that women have, right? So in this significant judgment, what Supreme Court has done is it has allowed the medical termination of pregnancy of this particular case, right? And this is important because of 3 reasons. First important reason is that Supreme Court has linked this particular development or this particular right as part of right under life and personal liberty, including bodily autonomy and privacy under Article 21. So in a way, we can see that Supreme Court has been expanding the horizontal application of Article 21. And initially or also earlier also, Supreme Court has done the same with respect to application of the Article 21 in different areas of rights. And this has now been reconfirmed with respect to this particular aspect. And particularly what Supreme Court has said, that no judicial body can compel a woman, particularly a minor, because here the case was of a 15-year-old girl, to carry out an unwanted pregnancy against her express will, right? So this is a very important milestone with respect to women empowerment and gender justice, because you can see here that there are two contrasting rights. On one hand, there is right to choose or pro-life, and then there's pro-choice, right? So pro-choice essentially is the right of women to exercise her bodily autonomy, reproductive right, etc., without any hindrances. And the pro-life lobbies are those who consider that everyone, even the fetus, has a life and it should not be terminated at any cost. So at that time of who it actually determines which should get a prominence over pro-choice or pro-life. So here Supreme Court has resolved this matter and said that it is part of Article 21 of the Constitution, because the reproductive choice is a core constitutional guarantee under Article 21. Secondly, Supreme Court has also taken a very liberal approach towards a law that governs abortion in India. So in India, abortion is regulated under a law that is called as Medical Termination of Pregnancy, Act 1971. So under this act, up to 20 weeks of pregnancy can be eliminated on opinion of one doctor, right? But this was a somewhat limited, it had feature that it applied only to the married women. So in 2021, this act was amended, which also allowed for unmarried women within this ambit, so that to provide for the women who were not actually married but have become pregnant because of maybe live-in situation or because of incident of rape or incest. Then for 20, it has also expanded the whole tenure from 20 weeks to up to 24 weeks for special category like minors, which will be dependent on the opinion of two doctors. So here you can see that the case that Supreme Court has presently decided is way past the 24 weeks. It was actually 28 weeks. So that is why this case went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has taken a very liberal opinion or a very liberal approach with respect to this particular right. So in a way, we can say that Supreme Court has not just looked into the letter of the law, but also Supreme Court has guarded or protected the spirit of the law. So with respect to the core issues with reproductive autonomy, we can look into a couple of things. So as we discussed earlier, there's always a choice or there's always a debate between pro-choice versus pro-life. And sometimes the conservative faction have been giving a lot of impetus to the fetal rights, the rights of the fetus, right? And this is particularly grounded in religion, especially Christianity. Now, this particular right sometimes come in conflict with the reproductive right of the women. And this was particularly seen in US recently when a very important judgment, Roe versus Wade, was overturned by Supreme Court in United States of America, which gave women reproductive autonomy. Now, in India, the reproductive autonomy is far greater compared to what is present in US, because in US, it is not particularly dependent on the entire country, but different states have different reproductive rights or roles, right? So in this scenario, in different states, especially in the Midwest area and the southern states, they have banned medical termination of pregnancy. The second important aspect is because of the denial of legal abortion, the problem is women become vulnerable and they approach unsafe, illegal procedures, and it leads to associated psychological and health burden, and sometimes it also leads to maternal death in India. That is why in 1971 in India, this medical termination of pregnancy was brought in for the simple reason that we wanted to control or provide safe option for women. And secondly, it was also part of population control as well. Third, there is also a patriarchal control on the whole process where women are treated as reproductive instruments rather than autonomous individual with reproductive choice. So the whole choice factor is subsumed within the patriarchal nature of the society. And then with respect to lack of decision-making power, which comes from this only. So as per the National Family Health Survey 5 data, only 10%, that is 1 out of 10 women in India, are able to independently make decisions about their own health, including the reproductive health. So these are some of the challenges that are arising as part of the reproductive autonomy of the women. So as a way forward, we can take the approach taken by Supreme Court recently in this judgment, and we can say that we must abide by giving as much choice as possible to women so that she can exercise her reproductive autonomy. Secondly, it will also contribute to population stabilization and gender empowerment or women empowerment. Now from this topic, UPSC has asked a question, not in a direct way, but it could be asked in an indirect way. So question is, the Constitution of India is a living instrument with capabilities of enormous dynamism. It is a constitution made for a progressive society, illustrate with special reference to the expanding horizons of the right to life and personal liberty. So here Article 21 has been expanded into environmental protection. It has been expanded to protection of the vulnerable community, right? For example, Article 21, that is right to life and personal liberty, has been expanded to environmental protection. Here you can give example of MC Mehta case, Subhash Kumar case, Vellore Citizen Forum case, etc., which has taken into consideration that right to having a pollution-free environment is also part to right to life and personal liberty. Then vulnerable section, where Supreme Court had upheld or had held that homosexuality is not a crime. That is, it decriminalized section 377 of the erstwhile IPC. And then with respect to gender right, you can talk about the Vishakha guidelines, which led into the law for Prevention of Women from Sexual Harassment at Workplace, that is the POSH Act. And then you can also talk about the medical liberal interpretation of the medical termination of pregnancy. So you can make sure that then you can talk about the prisoner rights. Here you can mention Hussain Ara Khatun case, Shatrughan Chauhan case. So you can mention, you can categorize all such things and say that how Supreme Court is acting as a vanguard to protect the fundamental rights of the people of the country. And you can categorize this into different domains like this. And here, this part, medical termination of pregnancy, has been looked into a liberal interpretation has been given here by the Supreme Court. See, this is how you use current affairs in your mains paper, because it is very high chance that UPSC may not directly ask you question from current affairs, but you have to utilize current affairs as part of your mains answer writing. So let us start with the second news, which is the Reserve Bank of India has cancelled the Paytm, the banking license of Paytm Payments Bank. And of course, this is part of GS Paper 3 Economy. And the reason why the RBI has cancelled the banking license of the Paytm Payment Bank is because it has failed to adhere to the guidelines of the licensing of the payment banks, under which act? Under the Banking Regulation Act 1949. So in this particular case, Paytm was violating some of the guidelines, including the KYC guidelines. So KYC norms were not properly followed. Secondly, for Paytm, it was also linking one PAN with different numbers or different account numbers. So in a way, there was a suspicion that because of this activity, maybe this can lead to money laundering, right? And that is why RBI, in the benefit of the customer or in the interest of customer and the investors, have chosen to suspend the license, to cancel the license of Paytm Payment Bank. So what is important here is not what has Paytm did here, but what is important is the concept of payment bank, right? So we need to understand what is payment bank, why it is important, what role does it play in the society or in the economy. That is what we need to know. And we should also understand how is it different from a traditional banking, okay? So just understand that traditional banking has two major functions. It accepts your demand deposit, or it accepts your deposit and it provides you loan, right? That is their two major function of a bank. Now, the problem with traditional bank is that it requires a lot of capital, right? Secondly, it also requires a presence in the form of brick and mortar. So because of the stringent requirement under the banking regulation or scheduled bank, it is not possible for the physical infrastructure of banks to be present across the country. So this leads to what is called as financial exclusion of people and also different region, including the rural areas. Now, to address this, in 2014, a committee was set up, and that committee was Nachiket More Committee. So Nachiket More Committee was set up in 2014, and it gave solution or provided suggestion for financial inclusion in terms of providing a very specialized kind of bank, which will not be doing the role of a traditional banker, but it will be providing financial inclusion to those people who have been earlier excluded by the traditional banking sector, such as the migrant population, such as the small vendors, right? So that was the purpose behind this formation of payment bank. So it was a niche or a specialized bank that is formed under the differentiated licensing bank licenses, operating at small scale with minimal credit risk. So it was specialized bank, and it also includes small finance bank. So these two types of banks were formulated: small finance bank, a small finance bank and payments bank. Now, what was the objective? The objective was to promote financial inclusion by serving the unbanked, those who did not have any bank account, or underbanked groups, those who had bank account but were not able to utilize the banking services, such as the migrant workers, the low income households. Now, what was the advantages of the payment banks? First, it helped increase digital payments, and it provided safe, low value transaction platforms. It reduced cash dependency, right? So these were some of the advantages, because now the vendors, especially those who required high volume transaction but low uh, uh, in terms of value, for example, hundreds of rupees, but several times over, right? So instead of couple of value transaction, it was high volume transaction that was catered here. Secondly, what was the regulatory framework? It is registered under Companies Act of 2013, and governance is Banking Regulation Act. So under this act, Paytm Payment Bank license was cancelled. Okay. Then RBI Act 1934 establishes the control of these banks over on the RBI. Then you have Foreign Exchange Management Act 1999, which regulates the foreign payment, etc. Then Payment and Settlement Act 2007, which talks about or which regulates the digital payment infrastructure. Then what is the capital requirement to start a financial or payment bank? They must have a minimum paid up capital of 100 crore rupees, and the promoter share has to be more than 40% for the first 5 years, and 75% of the fund has to be invested in SLR, that is the statutory or the government bonds, liquidity ratios, and 25% has to be invested with the banks. Then there are two things that we should understand. What are the things that payment banks can do and what are that they cannot do? So just understand that they can accept demand deposit, and at a time, the maximum demand deposit that they can accept is 2 lakh per customer, okay? But they cannot issue loans and credit cards. They can provide debit card, they can enable personal payment and cross-border remittances. So if somebody is sending money from, say, UAE to India, that can also be permitted. Cross-border remittances is also permitted, but credit card is not permitted. Then there is also borrowing, lending, and lend-in interbank market is also there, that they can participate in the call money, that is the short-term money, and CBLO, that is collateralized borrowing and lending obligation markets, as both borrowers and lenders. They can accept time deposit. They cannot accept time deposit, right? Which means that they cannot accept instruments such as fixed deposit that are for longer term. Then they cannot lend as such. They cannot issue loans, but they can lend to their own employees, right? So these are the things that the payment banks can do, but they cannot issue loans and credit card. They cannot accept time deposits such as fixed deposit, and they cannot undertake para banking or banking which is beyond or operation or services that are associated with banking, such as insurance, mutual fund, etc., unless explicitly permitted by the RBI. Now from this topic, UPSC asked a prelims based question, and here you can take a look into this. The establishment of payment banks is being allowed in India to promote financial inclusion. Which of the following statement are correct in this context? First, mobile telephone companies and supermarket chains that are owned and controlled by residents are eligible to be promoters of the payment banks. Second, payment banks can issue both credit and debit card. Okay. Third, payment banks cannot undertake lending activities. Now you tell me which one of the statement is correct under the comment section. Third news. Ministry of Science and Technology has highlighted that India's bioeconomy is set to grow to up to $1 trillion economy by 2047. And this is going to be a tremendous scope in various areas, and it will have a lot of significance as well. So this is a topic that is essentially from GS paper 3, science and technology, or it can be with respect to environment or economy itself. So here first what we need to understand is what is bioeconomy, why it is said, or what are the reasons we can say that bioeconomy is supposed to get to this level. So there must be something that is going on in bioeconomy, right? So first we need to understand what is bioeconomy, what is the potential of bioeconomy, and what measures have the government taken to promote the whole sector of biotechnology or bioeconomy. So first of all, what is bioeconomy? Bioeconomy is simply the use of biological resources plus the innovation and science with respect to the biotechnology to produce goods and services across various sectors, aiming for a sustainable economy. Now, what exactly are the achievements of India's bioeconomy, or what exactly is the potential? Okay, both are similarly placed, and we need to understand this so that we can make a sense of this statement that how will bioeconomy will grow up to be 1 trillion economy by 2047. So first thing is that historically we can see that they have grown tremendously. From 2014, the entire bioeconomy sector was of $10 billion, and now it has become $195.3 billion, which again can be very, very instrumental, right? Very high growth has happened here. This is contributing around 4.8% of GDP. Now, with respect to the startup, you can see that number of startups in 2014 was merely 50, but now they have increased to 11,855. So there's a huge research and development and economic activity which we can see in bioeconomy sector. Secondly, it is a very important under part, that is there are several growth drivers of bioeconomy. First, with respect to the government policy of uh, ethanol blending, and recently 20% blending of ethanol has been permitted, has been suggested by the government in petrol. Secondly, because of the various promotion of GLP-1 drugs for weight reduction, that is why there is another potential for bioeconomy. Thirdly, opening of dozens of new global capacity centers, global capability centers, and the usage of enzymes and microbes in industrial sectors like textile, such as which is called as biotextiles, detergents, food processing, biofuels, etc. So these are the reason why we can say that there is huge growth trajectory in the upcoming years. Then this has also led to lower current account deficit because of the usage of ethanol blending. We have seen a significant drop in the petrol imports, and this number is around 12 to 14 billion dollars saving. Next, it has also helped, or it is also helping, a lot of impetus is being done for the research and development in the cutting edge technology. For example, development of world's first DNA COVID-19 vaccine, then indigenous CAR T cell therapy, which is for cancer prevention, mRNA vaccine platforms, India's first indigenously developed antibiotic, establishment of a national biobank. So these are again very important developments which are happening in the biotechnology or the bioeconomy sector. Now, what are the measures which the government has taken to boost bioeconomy in India? And first, the most important one is the Bio E3 policy. So E3 here suggests environment, economy, and employment, right? So all the initiatives such as advanced biomanufacturing, such as textile, pharmaceutical, etc., biofoundry clusters, bio AI hubs, are going to promote economy or boost economic development. They will be good for the environment because the waste here will be sustainable, will be recyclable, and it will also promote employment because some of these sectors are also labor intensive in nature. Secondly, the Biopharma Shakti program. So Shakti program essentially is to promote India's capabilities in the biopharmaceuticals, right? And expand clinical research infrastructure. Third is with respect to research development and innovation fund. So for this 1 lakh crore rupees fund has been provided to support deep tech innovation, including the biotechnology. And lastly, we have Biotechnology Industry Research Assistance Council, that is BIRAC, which is a not-for-profit Section 8 company under Department of Biotechnology, and it has uh, started various initiatives like National Biopharma Mission, Innovate in India, that is I3, Biotechnology Ignition Grant, BIG, Small Business Innovation Research Initiative, SBI, RI, Biotechnology Industry Partnership Program, BIPP, etc. So these are some of the initiatives that have been promoted to support the bioeconomy sector in India, right? So this, we have discussed the initiative, and before that we have also discussed the potential or the significance of the bioeconomy for the Indian economy. So from this topic, UPSC has asked a very recent question: how can India achieve energy independence through clean technology by 2047? And a second part of this question was, how can biotechnology play a crucial role in this endeavor? So here you can talk about how the various policies of promoting ethanol blending can come very handy. You can talk about the fuel cell technology. You can talk about other aspects through which biotechnology can help in reduction of or promotion of clean technology or securing energy security or energy independence. Let us now move to the fourth news, that is locally led climate adaptation gains urgency in India. See, this news essentially highlights a couple of things. So what we need to understand here is that with respect to climate change, there are two major responses. One response is mitigation, and the other response is adaptation. So mitigation response basically mean that you prevent, or it is preventive in nature. So whatever sources leads to climate change or green or global warming, we tend to reduce the emissions. We tend to utilize better fuels so that emission can be controlled. So in a way, the mitigation strategy is essentially preventive strategy. Then the adaptation strategy is about survival strategy. It assumes that climate change has already happened, or human beings have limited capacity to change the course of or direction of climate change. So what adaptation suggests is that we must use certain technology to essentially survive in the whole age of climate change. So we can say that mitigation is largely driven by the centralized authorities, right? And because the policies are taken at the top level. But the adaptation strategies which are essentially felt across at the grassroots have to be taken at the grassroots level. So this is the point of the whole exercise, that or this whole discussion, that our prior strategies to develop or help climate change response was largely based on mitigation, and it was top driven or top to down or level driven, right? So, and this has led to a lot of climate vulnerabilities. So if you look at the data, some of the thing, why do we need locally led adaptation? So locally led adaptation is required first because India is highly vulnerable with respect to climate change. In fact, according to a report, India ranks among the 9th most climate vulnerable nation. And from the various extreme event, we have lost around $170 billion, and the event have been 430 extreme events have happened from 1995 to 2024. The second aspect is with respect to financing gap. The developing countries, including India, fall very short in terms of adaptation, and they fall around $310 billion annual adaptation shortfall according to a report by UN Environment Program. Then the problem is with respect to the local bodies' capacity, that they are not properly financed, they are not properly empowered to take up these measures. So it leads to a huge strain on their capacity. Therefore, it is very essential that we promote locally led adaptation, right? Now, what are the principles of locally led climate adaptation? First is about devolving the decision-making power, because it cannot be that center dictates something and the local authorities will be following that, because conditions at the local level vary significantly. So ultimate authority has to be given to the local body. Secondly, this will also be made the decisions can be made more accountable, because the farther the decision making is from the actual ground operation, the lesser is the accountability. So it is very essential that decisions which can be taken at the local level should be taken at the local level. And this is also called as the principle of subsidiarity. The second thing is with respect to addressing inequality. So different places have different requirement and different elites which tend to take up decisions for their own. So we need to ensure that decisions which are taken include gender, include people who are also from poor background, and it should be inclusive. Thirdly, the decision should be transparent and accountable. The processes should be open to all the local stakeholders, including the NGOs and the SHGs. Then there should be flexible programming. It should not be very hardwired so that only the rigid things can be followed up. It should be flexible with respect to the changes in circumstances. Then it should be patient and predictable. Funding should be given in terms of long-term, accessible, reliable financial support. Then investing in the local capabilities. This is very important because we want to increase their capacity, and this particular development have happened in Tamil Nadu, where the village communities have been empowered to assess the vulnerabilities and take measures in this regard. Then collaboration, active and investment. So that would ensure that a particular fund can be mobilized. Then understanding the climate risk. So we need to improve the local, traditional and scientific knowledge with respect to climate change so that people can understand what are the driving forces towards climate change. In light of this, what steps have been taken? So we have discussed the principles. We have discussed the reasons why local level adaptation measures are required. Now let us see what measures, actual measures we have taken on the ground. So first is we have national and state frameworks. And India recently has updated its nationally determined contributions. For the 2031-2035, it has put emphasis on climate resilience and adaptation into development strategies. Again, a very important development, because earlier our development strategies were not very much linked with climate resilience. So we now have included climate resilience and adaptation in our development strategy. Again, a very significant development. Secondly, we have also incorporated this framework into agriculture through National Innovation in Climate Resilient Agriculture. Now, ICAR, that is Indian Council for Agricultural Research, pilot program focuses on climate smart agriculture and farmer capacity building, because agriculture continues to be one of the most polluting sources, or one of the most sources from where methane or climate greenhouse gases emission is quite huge. Third, municipal green bonds. Municipal corporation of various cities in India such as Ghaziabad, Indore, Vadodara and Pimpri Chindwara have successfully raised climate finance by issuing green bonds. Other measures include, we have dedicated urban climate action plan by Brihan Mumbai and Solapur Municipal Corporation. Then second, climate resilient villages, and this was particularly emphasized in today's Hindu newspaper, where Tamil Nadu's Climate Resilient Villages CRV program has been particularly successful in adopting holistic strategy in 11 vulnerable districts, and they are working with the local communities. Right, so this is all about the fourth news. Now let's take a look into the last news, that is extreme weather events critically threaten terrestrial biodiversity by 2085, according to a study. And this is part of GS paper 3 environment. See, in the previous news, we talked about the importance of adaptation, and especially adaptation at the local level. This news is about how climate change is going to make the terrestrial biodiversity critically threatened by 2085, right? So in a way, both news are interlinked, but this news particularly talks about the impact of climate change on the biodiversity, especially the terrestrial biodiversity, and what can be done to overcome this. So this study was published in the Nature, Ecology and Evolution journal. Okay, it underscores the urgency of integrating climate mitigation with biodiversity conservation to safeguard ecosystem. Now, what are the key findings of the study? First is that there is compounding threats. So threats can be either linear or either independent, or they can be compounding, which means that couple of threats can combine together and create a more holistic, more difficult situation for the biodiversity. So in this case, 36% of the land vertebrate habitats will be exposed to multiple extreme climate events such as heat waves, wildfire, droughts, and floods by 2085. Now, because of climate change, heat waves are very prominent. And because of heat waves, it leads to wildfire. And because of wildfire, agricultural activities and the outgrowth of crops are also subdued, which leads to droughts. And then because of heat waves also, because of the water level rising, it can also lead to floods, right? So all these events are interlinked and they compound, they reinforce each other. The second is, within the primary threat, the most pertinent one is heat waves. And it is projected to expose 93% of the species geographic ranges by 2085, followed closely by extreme wildfire. So these two particularly are very critical. Third is taxonomic vulnerability. Here, amphibians are the most severely affected group, particularly by droughts. And with respect to the geographical location, species-rich Amazon basin, Africa, and Southeast Asia face the highest exposure to these compounding hazards. So see, this is how we analyze a report. We have seen what exactly is the nature of threat, so it is compounding in nature. We have seen what is the most pertinent threat. We have seen heat waves. We have seen which species or which kind of groups are the most critical or which are most vulnerable. We have seen that is amphibians, and we have also looked into the groups which are most critical, that are most threatened, that is the this region, Amazon basin, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So this is exactly the kind of summary that you should take away from this. Then what are the global initiatives? See, this is initiative where, so we have talked about some of the initiative from Indian side, especially with respect to adaptation. But such kind of operations need to be taken at the global level, because as such, climate change is something which doesn't respect a country's boundary. A global coordination and cooperation must be done. Therefore, the strategies to prevent or mitigate the adverse impact of climate change has to be global in nature, right? So the mitigation impact has to be global in nature, and the adaptation has to be local in nature, right? So here what we have the initiatives, UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, which has aimed to limit the global warming and reduce climate-induced biodiversity risk. Then IPCC recommendations emphasize protecting 30% to 50% of ecosystem for resilience as per the 6th assessment report. Then IUCN Red List and FAO's One Planet, One Health initiative that provides guideline towards prioritization of the at-risk species and climate-driven extinction. So you can see here that there are both generic suggestions in terms of reduction of climate-induced risk, plus there are very specific recommendations in terms of identifying the at-risk species and promoting their welfare. Then Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework of 2022, which under the CBD, it targets protection of 30% of land and oceans by 2030. And this is called as 30 into 30 goal. So 30% of target by 2030. So 30 into 30 goal, again, it can come as part of prelims. UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021 to 2030, it promotes restoration of degraded habitats, improving species resilience and adaptive capacity. So now we are done with this, the last news, that is about the protection of critically threatened terrestrial biodiversity. What exactly are the major findings of the study, and what are the major interventions that have been taken at the global level. So now let us start with the quick updates. So first is with respect to cheese. And why this is in news? Because Prime Minister Modi recently has congratulated the Indian cheesemaker for their global recognition, because some of our cheesemakers have achieved a lot of recognition at this international cheese competition, which was held in Brazil, right? And India won 4 medals in this competition. and especially the Eleftheria, Gulmarg and Yak Churpi Soft and Eleftheria, Brunost and Eleftheria Kali Miri had won these laurels. So let's understand the nature of the cheese, because once UPSC had also asked a question on mushroom. So first is brie style cheese is soft, creamy and covered in delicate white mold rind. Yak churpi is a traditional cheese from the Himalayan region, especially in Ladakh and nearby high altitude community. And Brunost is made from concentrated whey that is used in whey protein. Then Belper Nop style is crumbly, flavorful, and coated in black pepper. I would advise you to take a look into the images of these kinds of cheese that will help you recall the information in a better way. The second news is about Canary Islands, and it was in news because INS Sudarshini has made its first visit or maiden visit to Las Palmas, that is in Canary Island, first by an Indian naval ship. Now, this visit is part of a strategic halt during India's trans-oceanic deployment. And this project is called as Lokayan. So we have Chandrayaan, we have Gaganyaan, we also have Lokayan 26. So it is a 10-month pilgrimage or 10-month voyage, right? That is a transatlantic voyage. It started in January and it will be ending in the 10th month. And it is essentially a kind of diplomatic endeavor where we want to go and spread the news of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, and we also want to learn about ship making, etc. So in a way, it is a win-win situation for everyone. Now, what about the Canary Island? So it is an autonomous region of Spain. It is situated in the Atlantic Ocean and it is about 100 kilometers off the northwest coast of Africa. It is a volcanic archipelago with islands like Tenerife and Gran Canaria. It includes Mount Teide, that is Spain's highest peak, right? So these are some of the information with respect to Canary Islands. The second news is with respect to SAARC, where India has approved the withdrawal of 30 billion rupees for the Maldives under the SAARC currency swap framework. So we know that SAARC is presently not functional, right? But it doesn't mean that the institutions created under SAARC are also not functional. Now, this SAARC currency swap framework works within RBI, and it is a mechanism that helps the SAARC members overcome the balance of payment crisis. So, for example, here in this case, Maldives was facing a tremendous shortage of forex reserve, right? So India said that you give me loan or you give me money in your currency and I will provide you currency, equivalent currency of your money, of Indian currency, right? And later on, this can be again given back to India and India can give it back to Maldives. So in a way, there is a currency swap happening, right? And it can also be done in dollar or euro as well, as and when what is required here. But the key idea is that India wants to promote what is called as internationalization of rupee. At the same time, India is also following the neighborhood first policy, and it is also very significant from the project's Mahasagar initiative. So this framework introduced an INR swap window up to worth 25,000 crores, supplementing the USD Euro swap window and aimed to promote the internationalization of Indian rupee. So what is SAARC? SAARC is a regional organization aimed at building connected and integrated South Asia and promoting development and progress of the member countries. Established, it was formed in 1985 during the first summit in Dhaka. It has 8 members, all of you know which members are there. It also have Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, and Afghanistan. Secretariat located in Kathmandu. One more thing, you should also try to compare the functioning of SAARC with that of BIMSTEC, right? And can BIMSTEC be considered as an alternative of SAARC? Next news is on Scheme for Special Assistance to States for Capital Investment, SASCI. So first thing is, if a question comes like this, and they can ask you, what is this scheme for? So this is under Ministry of Mines or Mines Ministry, and it has instituted a 5,000 crore investment scheme, which is incorporated under this SASCI for this financial year. And what is this scheme all about? It is to promote or facilitate mine operationalization, increase mineral production, and enhance revenue collection by the states and improve overall governance of the mining sector. So under this, the central government provides funding to the states which are rich in minerals to ensure that all these goals are met, right? Then what is SASCI? It is a central sector funding, or it is central sector scheme under which the entire amount is provided by the ministry, that is under Ministry of Finance. Then financial assistance provided to the state government in the form of a 50-year free loan for capital expenditure. Again, a very good offer that is given to them. Next is about cerium magnesium changasite. Now this new mineral has been discovered in a lunar meteorite which was formed in China, right? So China had recently got a meteorite and it had named this as cerium magnesium changasite. It was found, the name of the meteorite was Pek 005, and it was found in Taklamakan in China. Now the total lunar minerals are 11. 4 of them have been discovered by US, and now China has also discovered 4 lunar minerals. Now what about this particular mineral? It is a rare earth bearing phosphate mineral with distinctive physical and chemical properties. It is colorless, transparent with a glass-like luster. And the importance of this especially is to help understand the volcanic processes on the moon and the distribution of the rare earth substances. Next news is with respect to Hindu Kush Himalayas. So according to the ICIMOD report, the snow persistence in Hindu Kush region has declined sharply for the 4th consecutive year. And what is ICIMOD? It is an intergovernmental body leading efforts to protect the Hindu Kush Himalayan region and its people, resources, and climate. So what is an HKH region? It extends 3,500 kilometers over 8 countries from Afghanistan to Myanmar. Other countries include Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. So these are the countries which would be part of the HKH region, that is the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. Next, why it is important? Because it is source of 10 large Asian river system, including the Indus River system, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, etc., Yangtze. So all the major river system of the Himalayan system is essentially sourced from here. Then mythos or mythos. So Finance Ministry has formed a panel under the SBI chairman to assess the risk from the Anthropic AI model that is called as mythos or mythos, right? So mythos recently has been launched by the Anthropic, and it has taken the world by storm because it has so much potential to detect the vulnerabilities of any system, right? And especially it can detect the vulnerabilities not which is there in any average system, but any very hard secured system can also be detected, and the loopholes can be found by mythos. So what has happened was that it was working in a regulatory sandbox, but it did not operate there, and it started working autonomously. That is why this has not been launched for the public at large. Anthropic has only released it to certain companies, certain technology companies, to ensure that their software is protected from mythos. So first is, it is autonomous security model, advanced unleashed frontier AI model with exceptional cyber security capabilities. So this is, the Anthropic has released the project, Mythos project, under the project Glasswing to a few trusted organizations under the controlled iteration for its evaluation. Second is, the term that would be frequently used is zero-day exploits, which basically means that it can identify and exploit zero-day vulnerabilities across every major operating system and web browser. So you should also understand what is the meaning of zero-day vulnerability. So in cybersecurity, what it means is a software or a hardware flaw that is not known to the developer who has created that software, whether it is a hardware software or the software is not known. And therefore, once identified, they will have 0 days to defend against it, right? Then what are the concerns with respect to Mythos? It can lead to automated cyber attack capabilities. It can threaten national security. It can threaten the banking sector, power sector, etc. It can lead to dedicated denial of services, right? So again, this is a very important concern, and India should also step up its AI governance, because initially, or as of now, India's AI governance has been soft touch, right? It is largely to promote the economy and largely to improve in terms of whether it is not creating inequalities. But at this time, when so much progress has been happening, India should definitely step up its game and improve its AI governance. Next news is with respect to Artemis Accord. And here this was a news because Jordan became the 63rd nation to sign the Artemis Accord. First of all, please do not get confused by Artemis mission. It's a different thing, and Artemis Accord is a different thing. So Artemis Accord was launched in 2020 under the Artemis Space Exploration Program. And it is a set of international principles led by US for peaceful and cooperative exploration of the moon, Mars, and the celestial bodies, right? So Artemis Accord is to enforce the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, which basically means that countries should use outer space for harmonious purpose, for peaceful purpose, and not to weaponize the outer space. Secondly, it should also ensure safe, transparent, and sustainable space activity. They should ensure that they are not spreading debris there. Third, they should promote peaceful use of outer space and prevent conflict, encourage sharing of scientific data, support interoperability, etc. Now, India is also a signatory of the Artemis Accords. Last news is on avocado imports in India. So, avocado has become a national sensation because of the surge in Instagram Reels, and also because the health benefits associated with avocado. Now, avocado import has surged in India because the demand has risen sharply, but the domestic supply has failed to keep up with the demand. And because of that, the imports have increased more than threefold to reach $42.27 million in FY26. So we largely source avocado from these countries: Tanzania, Kenya, Australia, and others. So what exactly is avocado? It's a fruit grown on the Persea America tree, believed to originate from Mexico/Central America. So it has the source, or the origin of avocado is Mexico or Central America. It was introduced in India between 1906 and 1914 by an American missionary, yet it did not found its footing until recently. In terms of the nutritional value, it is rich in fiber and healthy monosaturated fats, making it suitable for heart health and diabetes-friendly diets. It is one of the highest fat plant foods widely used in low carbohydrate diets. So this is all about the avocado imports. Now, we are done with the news today of today session. I hope this was important to you. Thank you and all the best.